Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Global Missions Podcast. If you're listening for the very first time, a special welcome to you. Our guest today is Duane Frasier from the JoshuaProject.net. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Joshua Project, it is a fantastic online resource for learning about and praying for unreached people groups. Before we get to today's interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Do you have your 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World booklet yet? If not, please consider joining in this focused month of prayer for our Muslim friends and neighbors. Ramadan, their time of fasting, will start on May 27th this year. It is a time when Muslims are especially spiritually focused. So let's be praying together that they find Jesus. To learn more about this great resource, visit www.30daysprayer.com. And now, here's today's interview.
Hi again, everyone, and welcome to today's interview. Our guest is Duane Frasier, who works with the JoshuaProject.net. It's based in a website. He'll tell us more about that, of course, working to highlight the gospel-deprived people groups in the world. Duane was a student at Bethany College of Missions and did an internship in Mexico, and now lives with his wife, Erica, in Colorado Springs with their two boys. Duane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Really glad to have you today for this discussion. And I want to begin with a word of thanks, actually. The Joshua Project, I might say, for some of my U.S. friends, is a ministry that I've really benefited from personally in my own study of missions. And I did explain this to Duane before we started recording. I use data from the Joshua Project in just about every public presentation that I do. I hope, Duane, you hear stories about this from time to time that we're using your work.
Yeah, we do. We just heard some just yesterday, actually.
Now, today our topic is unreached people groups. We want to better understand what we mean by these terms and get a common understanding and where we can get good information on this. The Joshua Project is looking to help provide that. Duane, just as we get going, would you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your work at the Joshua Project?
Sure. Well, as you said, I went to Bethany College of Missions, went to Mexico. That's kind of where I got my missions vision. Stumbled upon this thing called Joshua Project and wanted to be a part of it, especially when I found out later on that at the time it was just 3 people. Today we're 4 people. And that's surprising to people, I think, that we're so few on staff, but that means we wear a lot of hats. So I answer all the emails. If you write to Joshua Project, that's info@joshuaproject.net. I'll be the one engaging with you first, I think. Mm-hmm. And then I also handled the photos, the maps, and the descriptive text about people groups, which is very important. It helps us really to pray very well. My wife and I have done a lot with the Spanish, some of the Spanish translation of the site. Mm-hmm. And then I just handled the volunteers. There's volunteer opportunities as well.
Duane, we know you primarily through a web presence, so we don't get to see the team. You mentioned that you're 4, which I do find that remarkable, that you have such a site with such resources, and there are just 4 of you there, plus volunteers, I should add. Just take a minute and describe what your team looks like and what office environment you have, if any. How does it all work behind the scenes?
Sure. So we're all here in Colorado Springs. There are 4 of us. There used to be 3 until just a few weeks ago, actually. So we're very introverted people, I think, some of us, and we spend a lot of time in front of a computer screen. We're in a small office, very generously made available at a very modest cost from another organization here in town, and that's called B World. And so, yeah, it's just the 4 of us. The last person who just came on he'll be pretty much full-time generating maps for us. It's important to know where people groups live and that they live in a real place. So that's us. That's the team. But I did want to say four of us obviously can't do all this, pull together all this information without standing on the shoulders of a lot of people's research. So we're very beholden to the body of Christ.
Yeah, well said. We want to talk about the unreached task, about unreached people groups, and it's going to be helpful to define some of these things. Let's unpack some of these terms together, please. Let's start with the unfinished task. What do you mean by unfinished task?
The task there is what we're saying is we mean the Great Commission, the fulfilling of the Great Commission, which in all of its iteration really talks about people groups, even though maybe our versions of the Bible that we read don't bring that out into the translations very much. But when Jesus sends us out through the Great Commission, that's a task he's given to the whole church. Nobody's exempt from that. And too long into the future, we're not finished. And some of that may be disobedience. Some of it might be that we hadn't had the technology that we now have. But nevertheless, there's a task that lies ahead of us, and it's doable.
And when we say unfinished task, we want to reach certain peoples. What do we mean by people groups?
Yeah, so people groups, it's important to know that it's not groups of people. It's maybe a better word might even be ethnic groups. That might help people to be thinking along the right lines. So this is usually the peoples are distinct because of the language they speak. That's not always the case. In some cases, for instance, you'll see a lot of people groups on our website in India sharing the same primary language, but caste comes into there. So it's very much the language piece, the linguistic element, and the cultural element. So for us, from a gospel standpoint, a people group is any time that the message of the gospel would come up against a barrier of two types, either acceptance or understanding. Understanding's the linguistic bit. Acceptance might be that caste, cultural, that kind of barrier.
A subdivision. Yep.
Sure.
You mentioned the Great Commission, and some of our Bibles, it says, I'm just looking in the Gospel of Matthew in this case, verse 19 of chapter 28, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. And that might imply to some of us that means countries, right? Geopolitical nations like the United States or Nigeria. But it's not completely accurate to think of it in those terms.
Right. So for your listeners, especially those in the United States and Canada, we might think of the nations like, for instance, there were the Six Nations when we're talking about the Sioux Nation, for instance. So it's really the Greek word there is ethne, which you can hear the root for ethnic in that. So mostly when you hear the word ethne in Greek in the New Testament, or when you see it nations in English, it's talking about people groups for the most part.
So it's possible and actually usual that there would be multiple people groups in a country, and also a people group could be represented in multiple countries.
Yeah, that's why if you look at our website, and we'll talk later on about some numbers, that's why you'll see such a large number of people groups. That's because we're going to show them as distinct within geopolitical boundaries.
Very good. Okay, and as far as advance of the gospel then, we have this idea of a reached people group and an unreached people group. Could you unpack a little bit, what's the distinction between reached and unreached?
Yeah, it's very important. This is a pretty important word these days, kind of a word du jour. And so I'd really like us all to be very careful in the use of the word unreached. I'm just going to tell you what it means for Joshua Project, and it means this in some similar form for a lot of us in mission circles. For Joshua Project, we have numbers that are behind that definition. So for us, a group would be unreached if 2% or fewer of the population of that ethnic group were evangelical, 2% or fewer, and 5% or fewer would be Christian adherent. In other words, if you ask them on a census questionnaire, what is your religion? They would tell you Christian. That could be Mormon, that could be Orthodox, anything. And so above that, that takes them out of the unreached category. We wouldn't at that point call them reached. We prefer to say not unreached. But some of these groups have a lot of Christian adherents, but they wouldn't be true Christ followers. Mm-hmm. For us, the evangelical piece is our imperfect way. I want to stress that it's imperfect. Mm-hmm. Our imperfect way of estimating, engaging, and measuring true Christ followers. Mm-hmm. It's the only thing that we can use that we have data available for.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your mentioning that it's not a perfect way. We're dealing with numbers on such a grand scale here. How do you answer that critique or that concern when people say, well, how can you possibly count that many people?
Well, I guess the simple answer is you can't. Let's all be very honest and humble about the data. I think that's so important. Nevertheless, it's the best we've got, and it's quite stable. It's getting to a pretty stable place. And we don't hear a lot of negative feedback about our numbers. In some cases we do, and we adjust them. I hope your hearers aren't surprised to learn that Joshua Project would be very flexible about adjusting our numbers based on the best possible information we could get. The closer to the field, the better. Mm-hmm. But if we got that and we could verify that, then we would say, yes, we need to change that right away.
Duane, many of us know the Joshua Project as a website, but it's not only on the website. You also have apps. And so before we get to the data, I just want to make sure we mention the apps. I have an iPhone, and I have the Joshua Project Unreached app there. Tell us about the apps, please.
Yeah, this is an amazing thing that was actually begun by a gentleman in Korea who made our first iOS app for the Unreached of the Day. Unreached of the Day is where thousands of us, literally, are praying daily for one specific people group. Today, at the time that we're recording this, is the Moroccan Arabs of Morocco. Mm-hmm. Tens of thousands of people are seeing this on our website, on their websites, through emails, and specifically on the Unreached of the Day app. We have that available, as you said, in Android and iOS devices. And you can just search in the stores, just search for Joshua Project, or search even just for Unreached, and you should find that easily. And that's just going to serve it up for you daily. It's very helpful.
Mm-hmm. And just for those that can't see it right now, that I have it up on my phone right now. It gives me the population of this people group, the Moroccan Arabs, the status of the Bible, what they have by way of scripture. So in this case, New Testament only. They would be mostly from Islamic backgrounds, and then a people summary, obstacles to ministry, outreach ideas, and then prayer items, both for the followers of Christ and for the entire people group, all with a map to show you where this is taking place. So it's just a really sharp piece. Encourage you to check that out. Let's go to the website, Duane. And if you had somebody visiting the website for the very first time, they're listening now and they're going to go to check it out, where should they look first? What would you hope they find on the site?
Well, the whole focus of this is people groups. And so you should be funneled down to looking at stats about them, facts about how they live. So that's really where we want you to end up. We want you to end up with a heart for those people whose faces you see on our website. One thing I want you to know about the faces on our website, you'll see people group photos all the time, everywhere on our sites. Mm-hmm. None of those are stock photos. Each one of those represents a people group, a distinct people group. We've done the best job we can of collecting them and assigning them correctly. So to try to put a face to that. So you might come in through the avenue of geography. So maybe you're interested in Kenya. And so you go there, you look at the listing, you'll see a listing of every people group with a significant population at all that we know to live in Kenya, and then an indication of whether they're unreached or not. So that's where we really want you to end up. One of our most popular questions is going to be, how many people groups are there in the world? How many are unreached? That's always on the left-hand side of the main site, the main page. And that's fresh data. That's the best picture we have, and that's refreshed. We're never more than 2 weeks away probably from having that refreshed. Mm-hmm. So those numbers are the best we can get. There's more information beyond that on a separate page.
Sure. You mentioned a newer app as well, Duane, as you're continuing to learn. Tell us a bit about that.
We're excited about this new app. Our apps are done by volunteers. They're university students who donate their spring break and come to a hackathon here in town, and they've designed our apps. Their newest one, it's already available on Android. It's coming soon for iOS, and that is a data gathering app. This is a way for any of you to help us out for the sake of the body of Christ. So you can take a photo of a people group with that app, and if you have it enabled, it'll put lat-long coordinates there. You can tell us something about the church, their missionaries there. Any data you could about a people group you're encountering would really help to enrich what everybody gets to look at and gather from the Joshua Project website. Again, you can just search the stores for that. Again, you'll just find the Android. I think maybe you'll find the iOS, but you could just look for Unreached and data gathering.
Well, speaking of the data, let's just talk a bit about the data here. You mentioned how many unreached people groups there are in the world. About how many groups are we talking about, Duane?
So for just the unreached, what we're talking about is, and again, there's multiple counts for populations, significant populations in multiple countries. So we're looking today at over 6,700 unreached people groups.
And the total people groups would be over 16,000 somewhere.
Right, exactly. And again, that's when you take into account geopolitical boundaries.
So these are big numbers. Sometimes be helpful to talk about percentages, perhaps?
Yeah, so for instance, we're talking about those two numbers we just gave. Over 40% of the people groups in the world are listed as unreached. And we'll talk about where they're located, and you'll understand why there's so many of them when we take you where they are mostly. Okay. But if we're talking about population of the world, and you can see this on the front page too, that's about 42% of the population of the world lives in an unreached people group. They might be believers, but the population lives in these unreached people groups, 42% of the world.
Geographically, Duane, take us to the places now a little bit. Where are these unreached people groups located?
Probably quite a few of your hearers have heard about the 1040 window. And so that's a place in the world between the 10th and the 40th parallel. And it extends from West Africa over to Japan. And within this strip, and also beyond Indonesia, within this strip or window, as we've called it, live the lion's share, the vast majority of the unreached, also the poorest people. It's where the most Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus live in the world. And it's the area of our world that is, we would say, is the neediest, and certainly the most, as you used that term at the beginning, that gospel deprived. And so if you go to the Joshua Project and you look at some of our maps, and I think we're going to have a map showing later on, you'll just see it. You won't even need to have anyone draw a box. You'll just see by the colors there of the unreached where the greatest need is.
Well, that diagram is one of the two slides that I use in just about every presentation, which in very macro terms, there's green where the gospel has been established, if you will. There's yellow where the gospel is being established and still is in formative phases. I should say the gospel's in formative phases, but the church is in formative phases. And then there's red. And the red really extends across North Africa and through the Middle East, through the Indian subcontinent there, and then down into Asia and Southeast Asia. It just jumps off the page. And
yeah, especially for that Southeast Asian piece. So China comes in there, India, Pakistan, these countries actually, interestingly, that touch the 5 countries with the highest concentration of unreached people groups. They all share borders. It's just really interesting. Mm-hmm. I think we get a little bit of picture of God's will for us, some of us.
Mm-hmm. Why is it so important that we go to these places? Duane, you're providing us with strategic information. Why is it so important?
Well, I guess the simple answer would be that's the famous last words of Jesus when he was on earth was to send us to these places, the uttermost parts of the earth, these places where the need is the greatest. But also, there's a stat, some of you may have heard of this before, but 86%, this is an old stat, I'm going to give you the new stat. 86% of Muslims, 86% of Hindus, and 86% of Buddhists were seen to not personally know a follower of Christ. The stat isn't much better today. It's been updated, but it's 81%. Well, this is the go of the Great Commission because they don't live near us. And so those who don't know the Christians, they need Christ's followers among them. Some of your listeners have probably heard of visions among the Muslims, especially of a man in white. Jesus is appearing to them in dreams and visions. This does not let us off the hook because the vision usually is reminiscent of what happened to Paul, that someone's around the corner, someone's in the marketplace tomorrow that they're going to bump into who's going to tell them more about the man dressed in white robes. And Christ's followers need to know that there is this great need in this geographical area where so many unreached people groups live.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're a listener of this podcast on any regular basis, you know we talk about mission, including where God has put us locally, close to home, as it were. But we also acknowledge with this data to undergird this understanding that the vast majority of unreached people do not live in North America. For those of us that are in North America listening to this, they live in some faraway places, and we still need goers. The Lord is still calling people to serve as goers and to courageously go to these places to be salt and light and his representatives there. Well, we've just scratched on the surface of what all can be found in the Joshua Project. There is actually a resources tab. We didn't even touch on that, Duane, but let me just say quick that there are resources there. There are maps. There are PowerPoints. There are bulletin inserts that might be useful in your church or your small group as you help lift people's awareness and understanding and prayer engagement with these things. Duane, if someone wants to learn more, how would you encourage them to engage with you and with the Joshua Project?
Well, certainly for just contacting us directly, we'd love to help out. This is what we exist for. We'd love to plug people into several avenues. There's some great education out there. A lot of it we don't offer specifically ourselves, but we can point you to it. There are, as you mentioned, those resources on the website that can be helpful as kind of a, initial point. Mm-hmm. But one resource that I would highly recommend is the Perspectives course. Mm-hmm. It's very unreached people's focused. It's a brilliant course.
Mm-hmm. And we have a whole episode in season 1. I'll ask Rebecca, our producer, to make sure that that episode is in the show notes in case you'd like to learn more about the Perspectives course, which is available in different languages in many different countries around the world. Excellent, excellent resource.
Yeah, Perspectives will ruin you for God's purposes.
That's a good way to say it. We should tweet that. That's good. Now, how about just quickly social media?
Yeah, you can find us. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. And you can find us just by doing a simple search for Joshua Project. You would find us there. And we'd love to have you along and join that community. Every day, we're trying to post the Unreached of the Day there as well with a little bit different take on things. And you can engage with those photos and be praying that way.
Super. Well, Duane, just as we close, I'd like to ask you to share a story or an example of where you've seen the Joshua Project serving the way you intend. How is it bearing fruit?
I'll share a real short story, but there's an organization called Advancing Native Missions. They're actually based in Atlanta, but they work in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And they take our listing of people groups unreached in their countries, and they send out their national workers there according to our list. I mean, it's interesting to me that the people who live there might not even be aware of who's around them or the need that's around them. So they send out their missionaries according to that. And then they report that back to us and they say, hey, we've sent someone out to this place and here are the changes. Here are how many have come to Christ. And it's just a great picture of how we want things to work. We just hope that people use that as kind of a springboard into action. They do their thing. And then the best case scenario is that then they report back so the body of Christ knows the true picture.
Well, this has been very helpful, Duane. I just want to extend on behalf of our listeners our thanks for your spending the time with us today and for sharing some more about the Joshua Project. May the Lord bless you as you continue this work.
Thank you, Megs, for the opportunity to share.
We hope this episode about the Joshua Project has been informative and perhaps provided you with a new tool to help learn about unreached people groups and help you pray for an unreached people group each day. Go and check out the website, and we hope you'll look at the apps as well. In our next episode, we'll be hearing from David Joannis, who works among unreached people groups in Asia, and he'll help paint a picture for us of what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. We want to put some faces on the statistics and numbers we've heard about today. You can find links to resources from the episode here on the show notes at the website, globalmissionspodcast.com. And as always, we would be grateful for your help in spreading the word by leaving a review on iTunes or Google Play. That's all for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll talk with David and continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.